Hi, and thanks for coming. I appreciate you for being here. Today, we're going to create a list handler, or actually, we're going to create a read handler and repurpose our read handler to be a list handler, including pagination. So stick around, and we're going to get right on that. Thank you. All right, so this episode, we're going to work with the final bit of our announcements API endpoint. And what we're going to do today is create a way to read an individual record and output that as a JSON response. So that way some front-end system would be able to pull that and be able to gain access to an individual record and all the data that comes along with that. So to do that, now one of the things you may recall is that in the past, when I created in our announcements, let me open that up, in our announcements module, right? In the announcements module, I'd already created a handler for read. Now, in that read handler, what I did for the sake of the videos in the past is I made it a paginated list. Right? Well, that's not normally what I would put as a read handler. Normally, as a read handler, it would be an individual record, not a list of records from the database. Now, to do that, what I generally do is I create a list handler. Now, you'll notice that here in my handlers, I currently have a create handler, I have delete handlers, I have read handlers and update handlers, right? So that's just typical CRUD, C-R-U-D. That's the acronym we've all come to know and love when it comes to applications. Is CRUD, C-R-U-D, for create, read, update, and delete. However, I like my handlers to be very single purpose. I don't want them to be doing multiple things. I want them to have a single point of responsibility. Therefore, now, some folks, what they'll do is they'll make their read handler so it doubles up, right? It acts as a paginated list, and it also acts as a read, depending on how you call it. But to me, that just, I don't develop my applications that way, because that means that the read handler is actually doing two things. It's actually providing a paginated list, or it's providing an individual record. And again, I like having my code to be single purpose. So what I generally do is I create a list handler. So then I have a read handler, which is going to give me an individual record, and a list handler, which is going to give me a paginated list of all the records, in a paginated sort of format. So to do that, because I've already created the read handler as a list handler, what I'm going to do is then I'm going to refactor this application a little bit, and I'm going to change my read handler to become my list handler. Because that's essentially what it is. So I'm going to rename it. So what I'm going to do is in PhpStorm here, I'm just going to go ahead and choose refactor, and I'm going to rename it. So this is, instead of a read handler, this is going to be a read handler factory. This is going to become my list handler factory. Now, I'm not going to check any boxes here because I don't want PhpStorm to try to be smart and rename some things. I know what I need to rename, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and refactor that. So now I've got my list handler factory, and I'm also going to rename my list handler to become or read handler rather, to become a list handler. All right, so now I've got those renamed. What we've got is a little bit of a disconnect now, because right now, if I go back to my RoutesDelegator, we'll see that, at the moment, my list is currently not finding anything, right? It's not finding anything, and the reason is because there's no class named list handler. I renamed the files, but I didn't rename the classes. However, on the other hand, I've got my read handler, which is perfectly happy because it's still finding a read handler, even though I renamed the file, because the namespace is still being specified inside the file. So we need to do some renaming inside the file. So I'm going to go to my list handler factory first and handle that first. And we're going to rename this class to list handler factory. And then of course we also, because from the factory we're actually calling to our list handler, I need to change it so it will then call our list handler. Now it's going to cry, PhpStorm is going to cry a little bit right now because it's not finding a list handler, but we're going to tackle that in just a moment. I also need to pay attention to my return type hints, and because that is now going to be returning a list handler object versus a read handler object. All right, so now in my factory, that's really all I need to do is change it in those three areas. I'm changing the class name, I'm changing what I'm expecting it to return, and I'm also changing what I'm instantiating, which is a different handler in this case. So now if I go over to the list handler, we need to do some renaming in here as well. Again, I'm going to rename the class to list handler. And that really should be about all I'm doing here. Let me double check down the line here. And that's really it. So once I have that class renamed, now if I go back to my handler factory, it's now finding everything. It's happy. If I go to my routes, I can look in my routes and I can see that, yep, the read handler, it's now crying because there is no read handler, but yet the list handler is working as expected. So now everything should be working fine for my list handler as I renamed it from read handler. Now to test this, I've already got my Docker instances already running here. So you can see I've got my Expressive DB, my Expressive web running. I started those ahead of time. So now those are working. So now if I go to my scratches, in PhpStorm, we have scratches for making our calls. If I go to the list, I have a list scratch. Now, previously, that was my announcements-read scratch. However, I've renamed it ahead of the video. I've renamed it to be announcements-list. And so now if I execute this first one, which is going to call to the /announcements endpoint, run that, and I should get back the return. Oh, I got an internal error. So there's something that I did wrong or forgot to do. So let me double check this here. It's not really giving me any usable error. So let me see if I got, I've got my list handler. I've got my routes going to the right place. ConfigProvider, that's what I'm missing. So in my ConfigProvider, one more area to update. I'm still have my factory set as a read handler, so I need to change that. That's going to become list, and then my read handler factory is also going to become list. So now I've got that correct in my configuration. I should be able to go back and rerun this, and still not coming back good. Oh, there we go. Is it or is it not? My system's lagging a little bit on me. It's still not liking it, although I do have that specified there. Is it because... No, that shouldn't be an issue. All right, a little bit of investigation here. So my RoutesDelegator... okay. So my list right now is kind of confused because it's expecting there to be the UUID being passed in. And in this case, that is not what's going to be happening. So let me refactor a little bit there. I need to change the route. So the route is going to become /announcements, and then it's going to properly route to the list handler. Now up here in my read handler, actually I need to copy this down. My read handler will actually let me undo here. So I need to take this UUID because I repurposed this in the wrong way. So I need to take my ID. My UUID is actually going to come up here to my read handler because the read is going to become, in the future, after we create it, it's going to need the ID in order to display that. However, the list handler is going to need the pagination. So I'm going to take the page, put it down here, and so now that should be accurate. And I don't need this trailing slash for the page. I'm going to bring that up here. Yeah, I'm going to bring that conditional up here. Okay, so my read handler. Let me go ahead and reinitiate this now. And there we go. I'm getting back what I would expect because now my routes know what is really going on. All right, so as we can see here, I do have a paginated result. I've got 200 OK. I've got page number 1. I've got a page count of 3, so there's possible 3 because I've got a total of 11 items. My HAL is being returned as I expect. I've also got other links here that I can link to for self, next, or last. And then I've got all my records here within the result, and it's properly displaying those. Now, if I go back to my Scratch now, and I do have a second call in my Scratch for announcements/page2. So let me go ahead and initiate that, and we get a 200 OK. So let's scroll up and make sure that we did in fact get page 2. We did in fact get page 2, 11 items, total of 3. We've got our pagination being represented there in our HAL, and we can see that we are starting with sort 60, 70, and so forth as far as our sort numbers. So now we've got that working okay. All right. So let me minimize that. So that is my announcements list scratch, and we have effectively refactored our read handler to now be the list handler. So now we need to go and create our read handler to handle only one record. So being passed to UUID, it'll retrieve the one record. Okay, so let's go ahead. Because I've got Zend Expressive tooling installed here, I can then go in and issue the command composer expressive list, and I can get back the list of commands from the Zend Expressive tooling. Now, in this case, as in some past videos, we want to create a new handler, right? And in this case, we want to create a new read handler because we just renamed our read handlers to be the list handlers. Excuse me. So we want to issue the command composer. Now, keep in mind that because in our composer.json, we've actually specified the commands in there for Expressive. So we're actually passing these commands through composer. And then we want to do handler create. And the handler we're going to create is announcements. Announcements, put in our slashes there, handler, because it's a namespace. So because it's a namespace, we want the backslashes to be escapes. That's why we have to do them twice. So announcements, /handler, /announcements, announcements read handler. Okay, so now by issuing this command, announcements/handler /announcements read handler, Expressive will now create the read handler. I'm going to minimize the command line there, and sure enough, we can see in PhpStorm, we do have our handlers created for us as anticipated. We have our read handler factory, and we also have our read handler. Keep in mind that when you're using the Zend Expressive tooling and you create a handler, it creates the factory for you, which then points to the handler. So that way, if you have additional logic you want to put into your factory so you can inject it into your handler, it's already done for you. All that is already included in. All right, so now let's take a look at the handler factory, and we see that it's just a very generic factory. It's not really doing anything at the moment except for calling our read handler. So we want to add in so that we can do, as in past videos, so that we can do our HAL and get our hypermedia brought in. We now need to include the items that we're going to need for that. So a few things we're going to need. First off, we're going to want to pass in we're using Doctrine ORM, so we're going to want to pass the entity manager as well as the Zend Expressive HAL bits over to the handler. So we're going to go ahead and include those. So I'm going to change the return in this case, because this return is not returning anything. It is just simply calling the read handler instantiating rather the read handler. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to now instantiate the read handler, but also pass in some bits. We're going to pass in the entity manager, we're going to pass in the HAL response factory, and we're going to pass over the resource generator. Now we noticed that PhpStorm is not liking those commands right now, and that's because we have not imported in those libraries. So I'm copying those 3 libraries in here and importing them in. So we're importing the entity manager, we're importing the HAL response factory, and we're also importing the resource generator. And now with that, we're done with our factory. Those are the bits that we need to pass into our read handler so that it can get the record that we're expecting the read handler to return. Now, right now, PhpStorm is still complaining about the announcements read handler, and that is because it's not expecting 3 arguments to be passed into it as it's being instantiated. We're going to fix that right now. So let me go ahead and open up the read handler. Now, in the read handler, again, it's just the basic read handler setup. So now we need to add some items in here, right? So the first thing we want to do is handle our arguments that we're passing in, and that is the entity manager, the HAL response factory, and also the resource generator. So we need to handle those. So I'm going to now go ahead and put in the fields, protected entity manager. And then we'll also have protected the HAL response factory. All right, and the third one is going to be the resource generator. Resource generator. Okay, so now we've got our arguments passed in there. However, they're not being populated. We need to create a constructor to populate those. So I'm going to go ahead and create the constructor. And in the constructor, we're going to populate those items. But first, I need to add them in as arguments. So first off, I'm going to call the Doctrine entity manager, right? And the entity manager, entity manager. So we're gonna pull that in like that. That's our first argument. Our next argument is going to be the HAL response factory. All right, and then our third argument is going to be the resource generator. Just like that. And resource generator. So there's our 3 arguments. Indent those in. All right. So now we've got the 3 arguments coming in, or being injected in rather, from our factory, and now we need to populate the three fields that we created with these arguments. So we're gonna do this entity manager, and that's going to be equal to entity manager. All right, and next item is going to be this, the HAL response factory, and we're going to populate that with HAL response factory. All right, and the third one is going to be the resource generator, and we're going to populate that with the variable resource generator. All right. So now we've got our fields created, we've got our constructor with the 3 arguments being injected in, and those are then populating the 3 fields, calling them using this. All right, so now we've got that. Now that we've got those items done, we're ready to complete out the handler itself. Now the handler is actually quite simple because all we're doing is capturing the ID that is being passed, and based on that ID, then we're able to do a query, and then that query is just going to be output as simple JSON. So, so we're going to flesh out our handler. Now to do that, like I said, we're then going to have to populate our ID, right? Because the ID is being pulled in from outside, and that is actually being pulled through the request. So through the request, we're going to get attribute, and the attribute that we're going to get is the ID, and of course we'll do null as our default. I think that's what that is, right? Attribute, yeah, that's the default. The default is null. We're expecting null to be our default. All right, so now we've got our ID. The other thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and pull our, we want to specify from the repository, we want to specify what our repository is going to be. So we want to create a variable entity repository, and we're going to populate that from this the entity manager, and from the entity manager we're going to get repository, and that repository is going to be the announcements entity, and we'll pull it in just like that. So now we've got our announcements entity being pulled in, and that is what's going to populate and used as our entity repository. All right, then finally, what we need to do is specify our entity, and the entity we're going to populate the entity by using our entity repository we just specified, and we're going to issue the find command. And with the find command, we're then going to pass in the ID, and so that's it. So it's going to do a find on the database using the ID, and that's going to give us our entity, which is, of course, the record that we're pulling, right? Okay, so now we've got our handler, we're pulling our record. The next thing we want to do is do some sort of error checking, right? We want to see, did we actually get a record back from the database as we're expecting? So we're going to do an if, and we're going to check if it's empty, and what we want to check if it's empty is the entity. All right, and if that's empty, then we're going to do something, and what we're going to do is we're going to return some errors. So I'm going to bring that in here rather than typing all that out. I'm creating, in this case, an array with an error in it, because I like returning a payload with my errors, although I am going to return a JSON response with a 404 because the record doesn't exist. In this case, I'm going to return not only just a 404 HTTP error, but I'm also going to return a payload to give a reason why we're returning that error. Right? It's just a little bit more complete. I like returning that, so that way my API is being more informative about what's going on. So that's why I return that. Now that we've got that JSON response there, the next thing that we want to do is we want to take, in the case that the entity was populated and did return a record, I want to then create the how as well as the record and output that. So using the same code that we had in previous videos, I'm creating a resource. By using the resource generator, I'm taking the object, which is the entity we just retrieved, and I'm also passing the request as a second argument. And then I'm going to create the response factory, or return the response factory with the create response. Now I am missing, PhpStorm is crying a little bit right now because it's missing the response factory. It's also missing the JSON response. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring those in because I didn't import those in yet. So let me see what I've got here. I've got the announcements. I've got response. I've got the server request interface. What I don't have is my JSON response, because I am returning the JSON response in the case of an error. So now that will fix that. And then this response factory, I have an issue there. That's not actually a response factory. That's not what I should be returning there. Instead, what I should be returning is similar to the other ones in previous, where I'm going to actually be returning the how response factory. So again, I'm going to change response factory to be how response factory. Now it likes it, and it's going to be creating that how response for us. Okay, So now at this point, our read handler should be returning an individual record after it's being passed an ID. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a Scratch, and we're going to test this. So I'm going to open up my read here. Now I've already got an ID in here. I don't even know if that's valid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the database using the database panel in PhpStorm. I'm double clicking the announcements table, and I'm just going to go ahead and get this record here. I'm going to copy and paste the ID, which is of course a UUID. And I'm going to pass that in, or I'm going to copy that rather into my Scratch, because I know that this ID is good. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and execute this Scratch. So execute the call, and we see that we did get a response code 200 OK, and it looks like we did in fact get the record. We've got this sample announcement updated because we had been using that previously. So this worked. Now, on the other hand though, what happens if I put in an ID that isn't valid? Then I should be able to run that, and sure enough, I get back my error. I get back the response code of 404. So that worked okay. We know that that worked okay, and my Scratch was good. We've got a complete read handler. We've got our list handler being what we expect, and all is good. At this point, we've pretty much created our announcements module. So in future videos, we'll come back and I don't know what I'm going to be doing next, whether I'm going to be fleshing this out more with user authentication. Maybe I'll include some unit tests, or maybe what I'll do is just go ahead and start fleshing out some of the other modules, like creating the banks module might be my next one. And then we can, you know, I don't need to do the CRUD portion of that because I've already shown you that in the announcements. So what I would do then in the banks is maybe do something along the lines of, let's create some associations. So some doctrine associations. So I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do in my next video, but it'll be something along one of those lines. There's a lot of places I could go there. I'll have to see what makes the most sense, so that way I can sequentially make these useful for you. So thank you for coming. If you enjoyed the video, please like it down below. Also, tell your friends about Beachcasts. Have them come out and check us out. Share it on Twitter or on Facebook. Share the videos. You know, tell other folks about it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. Click subscribe down below. I really appreciate it. And with that, that's all I have today. So thank you very much.